It means that I'm probably gonna have to change the whole title to my show because I've been doing it wrong the whole entire time.
Um, no, I think language definitely matters. Even if we don't necessarily intend something to be a certain way, it can be interpreted that way. Like personally, that's one of the reasons that I say sex industry or sex work. I very rarely say sex trade unless I'm talking about like specifically in a legal context. Only because there's a lot of stigma around something being a trade. At least in America, that's usually something that's vilified. So like the drug trade, right? Because our government did this whole war on drugs thing that really just meant like arresting poor people for having marijuana. It didn't really stop like addiction, anything like that. And so like, at least in America, a lot of times when trade is tacked onto something, it's meant to stigmatize it and put it in a negative light. Like, oh, we have to stop the drug trade because we can't have people smoking weed, right? Like, I don't know if y'all know, but weed is a Schedule I drug in America. So that means like it's legally classed the same as like heroin or cocaine, which is kind of, right, which is kind of wild.
Right.
But that's, again, because that's the drug trade and it's meant to be stigmatizing. It's meant to create essentially propaganda and talking points that justify like a police state. It's meant to justify putting people in prison for petty crimes and those sort of things. And so I see a lot of that sort of same attitude when it comes to talking about like sex trade in the term sex trade. A lot of people who say sex trade are usually not actually in favor of sex workers having rights. They either want to force sex workers out of the sex industry, or they're okay with having like an extra surveillance state of sex workers because they're in the trade, they're doing something that's bad. And so I find with sex work, there's sort of like two different thoughts. One of them is a more conservative, right-leaning thought, which is sex workers are just immoral people because they're having sex. But I also find from like the leftists that there's a lot of attitude that like, oh, sex workers are poor victims stuck in this trade they can't get out of, they need rescue. And so there's this like rush to rescue sex workers without asking what help looks like to sex workers. And so it's just created like a lot of problems and bad policies. But it really does, in my opinion, have a lot to do with that terming like sex trade, because the trade is always seen as kind of like a negative thing here. So that's why I say that. Please, like, don't say prostitutes, don't say prostituted women. Those terms just drive me up the wall. But yeah, sex workers, sex work industry, it is a bit vilified. That's why personally I say sex work. Typically, if I do say sex trade, I'm really, and this is something that I mentioned earlier about like, people don't necessarily understand how like your quote unquote real life is different from politics. If I'm talking about things in a political, like legal sense, I may say sex trade because that's like legal jargon. But if I'm like actually talking about sex workers or sex workers, I just say sex work. Yeah, it's very, and I think a lot of folks do come into this with good intentions, but they don't understand how complicated the conversation is. So they just sort of latch onto the first thing that sounds good and don't necessarily realize the harm that causes. So yeah, don't say sex trade, say sex work industry.
You got it. This is now sex work and Marxism 4. Right?
I mean, yeah.